Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. I'm Mark Pettis, and today we're starting a little lesson on how to read Russian poetry, right? So this is for beginners who don't know really anything about Russian poetry, and we're going to learn just basically how to read it, right? Now, the good news is that, sort of a disclaimer right off the bat, you don't need to know anything about anything in these videos in order to read Russian poetry correctly, right? All you need to know is how to read Russian, period, right? How to pronounce Russian, how to where to place the stresses in Russian, which, as we know, is a very important part of Russian pronunciation in the first place. Right, so in this sense, reading Russian poetry isn't any different from reading Russian prose, right? In the sense that we are simply reading the words that we see on the page in front of us, right, in a correct way. And again, part of that means stressing the correct syllables, right? On the other hand, if we know something about how Russian poetry is structured, and when we're speaking of traditional Russian poetry like Pushkin, Lermontov, and so forth, then typically the poetry is very rigorously structured from a formal perspective, right? And we're speaking, of course, of a meter, right? Poetic meter. How is a line of verse structured? We're going to see that in Russian that has a lot to do with which syllables can receive stress, right? So knowing something about the meter, that is the general pattern to which a given poem is adhering, that can help you know where the stress is probably going to fall, even on words that you might not be familiar with, right? So it can be a help in that way. Beyond that, of course, knowing something, just kind of internalizing these rhythms, these various meters that are so often encountered in traditional Russian poetry, can help you enjoy them more, right? It can help you appreciate the musicality. You can start hearing the rhythm and reading it correctly and really feeling it in a kind of intuitive way. But again, there's no sort of secret knowledge here in terms of, knowledge of poetic meter, that will shed any additional light really on what we simply have on the page in front of us. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't think that the stuff we're learning today about meter is something that's imposed sort of artificially on the actual language itself, right? This isn't something we have to know and then sort of look at a text on the page and then subject that natural Russian text to some sort of completely artificial pattern. I think a lot of times students get that impression, maybe because I don't explain it very well. And so they're confronted with the text on the page, even with the udarение marked, right, the stress syllables marked, and they still start reading it very artificially in a way that just completely clashes with what's literally sitting right in front of their eyes, right? So with all this in mind, let's go through the basics of Russian versification, right? That is, how are Russian poetic verses structured? And then we'll look at several examples of the various patterns, the various meters to which a given Russian poem may adhere. Right, so there are any number of different systems of versification. If you know other languages and have read other poetic traditions, you may think, how are poems in those languages structured? Right, it could be something like German, what's called Stabreim, which had to do with repetition of consonant sounds, right? It could be something like Polish or French poetry, classical French poetry, which is syllabic, meaning that the only thing really governing a line of poetry is the number of syllables, right? Just counting the syllables. So, for example, in Polish, you could have a line of 9 syllables or 13 syllables. Right, and that's the only thing governing again, formally, the way the verses are structured. Now, Russian, by the way, there is nothing stopping Russian from going the route that Polish poetry took, namely syllabic poetry, right? And a lot of early Russian poetry, for example, in the late 17th and 18th century, when the Russian literary tradition was really taking shape. And of course, a lot of this crystallized with Pushkin, right, who really kind of established the sort of gold standard for traditional Russian poetry. More on that later. But initially, they were competing traditions that Russians were looking to in order to establish their own Russian verse, right? And of course, they did kind of dabble in the syllabic system that you saw, for example, in Poland, right? But that system didn't win out in the end, right? What won out wasn't syllabic poetry, but something that in Russian is called syllaботоническое стихосложение. In English, that would be syllabotonic, right? So we can look at that term syllabatonic and we can see that it has something to do with syllables, right? That is, on the one hand, it is syllabic in the sense that the syllable count does have something to do with this system of versification, but there's something more to it. Now, this term syllabatonic reaches back to a Greek term, and of course, a lot of this stuff we'll be discussing today in terms of versification and poetic meter and poetic feet reaches back to the ancient tradition in Greece and then later Rome with Latin poetry, which was governed by syllabi, right? Syllabi would be the word for slog in Russian, which means a syllable, right? So the syllable count was important, but there was more to it. So the syllabatonic comes from the Greek syllabi and then tonos, which is cognate with our English word tone. So essentially in ancient Greek, for example, what mattered was both the syllable count and long versus short syllables, right? Greek has long versus short vowels, at least in ancient Greek. And same thing in Latin poetry, right? The issue was, again, syllable count plus which syllables are long, which syllables are short. Now, in Russian, we don't have long versus short vowels, right? But we do have udarение. So essentially in Russian, stressed syllables are doing the work that would have been done in ancient meter by a long syllable, right? A syllable with a long vowel or with multiple consonants and all that. It gets kind of complicated. Okay, so essentially in Russian, what we're worrying about in terms of the formal aspect of Russian poetry, right? It's the Russian versification is syllable count plus where can stressed syllables occur, right? So the count of syllables and which of those syllables can be stressed or are usually stressed or could usually be stressed. More on this in a moment. Okay, so in a more practical sense, all of this boils down to the idea of a poetic foot. And you may be familiar with this from like English classes, English literature classes in high school, right? You may have learned what, for example, an iambic foot was or a trochaic foot, right? So a foot is kind of you can think of it as a building block of the larger verse, right? So a foot is going to consist in Russian of, for example, a stressed syllable and an unstressed syllable, or first unstressed and then stressed. So that would give us a two-syllable poetic foot. And then the other issue is how many of these feet do we get in a given line of poetry, right? And that would give us ultimately a sort of syllable count for the line of poetry. Okay, so let's move on and look quickly at a Shakespearean sonnet. So you may have done something like this in high school where you scanned a traditional English poem like Shakespeare or whatever. So I think if you think back to that, a lot of what we were saying today is pretty familiar, right? So let's take Sonnet 73, very familiar, and let's scan it. So when I'm scanning a poem, I use my own little kind of system. You don't see this in a lot of books. It's not really standard, but to me it's a lot faster and kind of visually more intuitive, right? I just put a little dot for an unstressed syllable and a big forward slash, or you could think of it as an accent mark to mark a stressed syllable. Right, so if we do that, and with Shakespeare's sonnet, let's read the first couple of lines. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few do hang, upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Okay, so hopefully you can pick up on the rhythm there. Now, we should say that, as we know, stress in English is a lot weaker than Russian, so this pattern may actually not be quite as readily apparent when we're reading English poetry as it will be when we read Russian, right? Because the Russian udarение, the stress is so much more emphatic, more forceful than English. But even so, if we start going through this very slowly, very carefully, that time of year, right? So time and year are both monosyllabic nouns, obviously. They're going to usually receive stress. But little, like an adjective, a demonstrative like that, a preposition like of, a pronoun like thou, they may not usually receive stress. I mean, typically we would not expect them to be emphasized in any way. Now, the third stress syllable here is maced, right? That's a verb, and we would expect a verb usually to get stress. Again, this is a monosyllabic verb. In me, right, there's a little prepositional phrase. The preposition doesn't get the stress. Me also may not really get a whole lot of stress, right? But for scanning purposes, we could say, okay, we'll say me is stressed. And then the final word here, behold, two-syllable verb. There's going to be a stress somewhere probably, right? And here it's not behold, it's behold, right? Behold, stress on the second syllable. Okay, so I think we can probably arrive at least, agree roughly on the scanned version of this line. But keep in mind as we're going through today's lesson, not only in English poetry, but also in Russian, there may be various ways to read a poem. For example, with pronouns like me, right? Well, a me could sort of just kind of go with the flow and not receive any particular stress, or it may be emphasized for whatever reason. We would say yes, it does receive full stress, or it may fall somewhere in the middle, kind of a secondary stress, kind of a half stress, right? And that would kind of depend on your own maybe interpretation of the poem or how you choose to read it, right? What intonation you give, what rhythm you give to the line of poetry. But we don't really need to get into all those subtleties today, right? We're just looking at the basics. And I think we could say, right, that first line, if we scanned it, we would get da-dun, 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 right? And we get iambic feet, right? Da-dun is an iambic foot, right? Which means unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, right? Da-dun. And if we count these out, we see that each line here has 5 iambic feet, right? Da-dun, 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 5 iambs. So as we'll learn in a moment, we would call this iambic pentameter, right? Using the Greek, right, sort of numbers, right? Pentameter means, I guess, something like 5 meter, right? Meaning there are 5 feet in this poetic meter, right? 5 feet to a line. Now let's keep reading a little bit, and we'll see kind of the other important thing of including in Russian versification, right, is that the meter basically establishes a pattern, a general pattern, right? But any good poet is not going to sit there and robotically and slavishly follow the meter, right? They're going to start deviating from it, and you're going to get kind of rhythmic variations, right? Now, in the first 3 lines here, again, there may be some room for debate, but we're basically getting iambic pentameter, right? So he's sticking to the meter pretty closely. Let's listen again. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. It's only in that 4th line that we see something that may be a little bit suspicious, and that is in the opening foot, right? Bare ruined, right? So we have a monosyllabic adjective followed by another adjective, actually. So 2 adjectives, both 1 syllable, that we would normally expect to get a stress, right? Why not, right? Bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Okay, so that first foot there, we could say is a spondy, right? A spondy is a word, kind of a special term for a foot where you have 2 stressed syllables instead of, right, one of them being unstressed, right? So that first syllable really shouldn't be stressed according to the meter. Here it is, so it's a rather jarring deviation from the meter, and we call that particular deviation a spondy, right? 2 stressed syllables. Okay, if we read further a bit more, right? Bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day. Okay, look at that 4th foot here. In me thou seest the twilight of such day. You see how the first 3 feet are pretty clearly, in me thou seest the twi. Okay, so we have 3, I think, what are pretty clearly iambs. But then we have kind of a gap there, right? The twilight of such day, right? The final day is stressed, we could say, but twilight of such, you could read that as right, basically the 4th foot not having a stressed syllable. And we would call that a pyrrhic foot, right? A pyrrhic foot is a foot in which there is no stressed syllable. And we have this kind of, metrical gap there, right? We're not getting the stressed syllable that we could have or that we may be expecting based on the meter. Okay, so those are the 2 basic deviations. We'll see the same thing in Russian, right? Basically, the meter tells us which syllable should be stressed, or it would usually be stressed. And so there are 2 deviations, right? A syllable that wouldn't normally be stressed is stressed, which is relatively uncommon, right? A spondy is relatively uncommon. More common is the pyrrhic foot, where we have no stressed syllable. Even the syllable that could have been stressed based on the meter is not stressed. Okay, so if we look over the whole scanned poem here, we see those variations, and that's what really gives us not kind of the monotonous meter, but rather the actual rhythm of the actual realized poem. Right? It doesn't always hew, strictly to the meter necessarily. Okay, so a couple of terms in Russian, right? The Russian for meter is meter, right? And we could, again, the meter is sort of the pattern. A pyrrhic foot is a pyrrhichi, right? Again, from the Greek, and a spondee is spondie, right? So those are the names of the two, right? A pyrrhic foot and a spondee. So again, with all these variations in mind, we get what we could call rhythm, right? The actual rhythm of the poem, again, as opposed to the meter, the pattern. Now, don't confuse the term in Russian rhythm with rifma. Rifma has to do with rhyming. We're not really talking about rhyming today, but of course, a lot of traditional Russian poems, they have some kind of a rhyme scheme, meaning you have rhyming, rhymes at the end of a line and certain patterns for where the rhymes occur and whatnot. All of that stuff is rifma, and it doesn't really necessarily have a lot to do with meter per se, right? So we're not really talking about meter today, but you will notice that all of these Russian poems we're reading do have a rhyme scheme. Okay, so we see now generally what we're dealing with Russian, right? We're dealing with poetic feet. So all that remains in today's lesson really is to survey the various kinds of poetic meter. And again, when we say meter, we're really talking about the building block, the foot of a given meter, right? So that's the first thing, is what foot are we using to build the poem? And then the question is, how many feet are in a given verse? That's going to give us our syllable count, right? Or as we normally say, the number of feet in the given line. So let's start out first with two binary meters, right? Binaries. The one we just saw, the iambic foot, would be an example of a binary meter, because it's a meter. A binary meter is a meter built with feet consisting of two syllables. Okay, so there are going to be two of these. The first one would be iambic. The second would be trochaic, right? Iambs and trochees. Right, so let's start first with iambic, right? Da-dun, right? Unstressed followed by stressed. That's an iambic foot. And let's look at some different Russian poems. All of these are very famous with different line lengths, right? So let's start out first with Imbic Tetrameter, right? So that's 4 iambs to a line of poetry. And let's take a Pushkin poem, right? «Я помню чудное мгновенье, передо мной явилась ты, как мимолетное видение, как гений чистой красоты». Okay, that's iambic tetrameter, right? A binary meter, by the way, in Russian is двухсложные размеры in the plural, and singular двухсложный размер. Размер, you may have heard in Russian, usually means something like size, but here we're talking, in this kind of specialized context of poetic meter. Двухсложный is a compound adjective made from the genitive form of dva, dvuch, and then an adjectival form of slog, which means syllable, right? So двухсложный basically means two syllable, right? Having two slogs, so to speak, right? A slog is a syllable. Okay, so an iamb in Russian is yamb, right? And here we have 4 of them, tetrameter. So the Russian version of the Greek tetrameter would be четырехстопный. Again, a compound adjective made with a number in its adjectival form. From четыре, we get четырех, and then stopny is the adjectival form of stapa, which is kind of an old Russian word, literally meaning foot, although we don't use that usually in modern Russian to talk about feet. We would just say naga, right? But anyway, четырехстопный ямб. Okay, so again, look over at the scanned version. Again, we're going to ignore any sort of subtleties or disputes here and just kind of give our best take on this. Я помню чудное мгновенье. Okay, and look what happened here. On the third foot, we have what we would call a pyrrhic foot, right? So again, the meter is telling us that iambic tetrameter would be da-dun, 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 right? It's kind of like a metronome, right? With just this endlessly monotonous meter. But then we see that Pushkin, he's not usually going to write that way, right? He's going to get some variation, some rhythmic variation with these pyrrhic feet here. Okay, so as we're going through this, let's think more carefully. Я помню чудное мгновение. What if we read this line according to the meter, right? Well, we would get Я помню чудное мгновение. Right, that would be if we were sort of sticking strictly to the meter, right? Da dun da dun da dun da dun. Я помню чудное мгновение. But of course, we wouldn't read it like that, right? So here's what I was referring to earlier, right? We're not taking what we see on the page and putting stresses anywhere where they wouldn't normally occur, right? And here we've marked the stress for learning purposes, right? Я помню чудное мгновение, right? All we're doing is pronouncing that correctly. And again, the rhythm should just take care of itself, right? But I found that students, again, they get this kind of mistaken idea that we're doing something entirely artificial, and they just start really basically mispronouncing every word in the line potentially, right? For no particular reason. So just follow the stress marks, right? Я помню чудное мгновение. Now the tricky part may be to kind of, again, accommodate that sort of gap, that pyrrhic foot, right? And just let it go, right? Don't insert a stressed syllable there, for there is none there, right? Я помню чудное мгновение. Передо мной явилась ты. Okay, that second line, we don't have a pyrrhic foot, right? Передо мной явилась ты, right? That is if we stress the pronouns, right? So again, there's this issue. Do pronouns take stress? Well, here I would say these are fairly important, right? In front of me appeared you, right? We have this kind of me-you opposition. Передо мной явилась ты. I would probably tend to say those are stressed. But again, look at the first one, передо мной. We have a prepositional phrase. Depending on how you read that, maybe it's not receiving full stress. Okay, but again, these subtleties aside, we're clearly generally following iambic tetrameter. That is the meter of this poem. So let's read the whole stanza again, and again, listen carefully to the rhythm. Я помню чудное мгновение, передо мной явилась ты, как мимолетное видение, как гений чистой красоты. By the way, one thing to watch for are these extra syllables. You may have noticed we have in the first and third line kind of this extra unstressed syllable hanging on. That's what we would call a feminine line ending. Right? Mgновение, видение. You see that those two words rhyme. Those are feminine line endings. And so on occasion, we may see that kind of thing happening where we have in some lines an extra unstressed syllable, but that wouldn't affect the way we're assessing the meter, the way we're scanning the poem or determining its meter, right? It's still iambic tetrameter. Okay, what if we add an extra iambic foot? We would get iambic pentameter, right? 5 iambic feet. So we get a longer line. Another famous poem from Pushkin. Я вас любил, любовь еще, быть может, в душе моей угасла не совсем. Но пусть она вас больше не тревожит. Я не хочу печалить вас ничем. Okay, let's look at the first line carefully. Я вас любил, любовь еще быть может. Right, now again, я вас любил. We have two opening pronouns, right? Maybe some question, я вас любил. Again, we could say that neither of those get stressed. Я вас любил. Or я вас любил. Right, so maybe a bit of an open question, but again, it's usually enough to scan maybe 2 or 3 lines of a poem to be pretty certain about what meter you're dealing with, regardless of any ambiguities or deviations. Я вас любил, любовь еще, быть может, в душе моей угасла не совсем. Но пусть она вас больше не тревожит, я не хочу печалить вас ничем. Okay, so hopefully you can hear that rhythm. The first and third line, again, we're seeing these feminine line endings, but that doesn't affect the overall meter, right? We're clearly dealing with iambic pentameter. We do see, I guess here, at least 3 pyrrhic feet, right? So we can already see that having pyrrhic feet is quite common in Russian poetry. That's the most common rhythmic variation. Again, a syllable that could have been stressed under the meter is not stressed. Okay, what if we add another iamb to a line of poetry? We get iambic hexameter, and this is pretty much the longest iambic verse you're likely to see in Russian, right? 6 iambs. That's about as long as it gets. And that reaches back to classical models. Since this line is so long, typically it'll be broken in half by what's called a caesura, which means some kind of a pause. Often that will involve an actual punctuation mark, or at least a comma, or maybe some other type of kind of logical break in that line to break it up. Again, if you read classical French poetry, this is a big deal, right? If you're reading Racine or someone like this, a lot of times there's a kind of opposition between the two halves of the poem. There's kind of an elegant, kind of logical structure in terms of the two halves of each line of poetry. Okay, so again, look for caesuras in lines like this in Russian, and think of the line in terms of two halves. Okay, so let's read this. Пора, мой друг, пора, покоя сердце просит. Летят за днями дни, и каждый час уносит частичку бытия, а мы с тобой вдвоем предполагаем жить, и глядь, как раз умрем. Okay, this one's, I think, fairly straightforward. Пора, мой друг, пора. Right? Пора, that's an I am. Мой друг, okay, the moi, just this kind of possessive adjective. The drug, the actual noun, that would tend to get stressed, right? A noun would usually be stressed. Мой друг, пора. Пора, мой друг, пора. 3 iambic feet. Покоя сердце просит. Okay, again, we see there, we've marked the stresses. We have 3 stresses, so we don't have any pyrrhic feet in that first line, right? Certainly. Летят за днями дни. Летят, stress on the second syllable. За днями дни, right? Again, no deviation. Та-дун, та-дун, та-дун. Летят за днями дни. И каждый час уносит. Again, час, that's a monosyllabic noun. We haven't marked the stress because we know there's only one syllable, right? But again, in terms of the scanning the poem, we would say it gets the stress. And again, still no deviation. Частичку бытия, а мы с тобой вдвоем предполагаем жить и глядь, как раз умрем. Okay, so it's only in line 3, I'd say, that we get any kind of rhythmic deviation. And at this point, it's maybe a bit of a surprise, right? Because the first 2 lines, again, somewhat unusually, he's stuck very closely to the meter. Okay, let's see. Let's move on to troches, right? I'll try to speed this up a bit. So we're still talking about binary meters, right? Двухсложные размеры, but now instead of iambs, we're using troches, right? So a troche is the opposite, right? Dun-dun. Stressed syllable followed by unstressed. Okay, if we have trochaic tetrameter, right, that's 4 iambic feet in a line. Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. In Russian, the term would be четырехстопный харей, right? Something like 4-foot trochaic verse, right? Charye would be a trochaic foot, a trochee. Okay, so I should mention, by the way, that iambic verse, the iambic foot, has been kind of established, especially by the time Pushkin came around, as sort of the standard, the gold standard for Russian poetry, for traditional Russian poetry. So you'll see a lot of iambic poems when you're reading, again, Pushkin, Lermontov, Troches, right, these kind of classical Russian poets. So you should think of troches as being somewhat unusual, right? They're fairly common, of course, but they're a little bit less common than iambs. And what's the difference? Why would you choose troches over iambs? Well, you could talk all day about that probably, and it may ultimately be somewhat subjective. But I think most people would say that troches have a little bit more kind of push to them, a little bit more emphasis and kind of forward propulsion or something, as opposed to sort of the more reserved, more stately, more laid back iambs, right? So you open up right out of the gate with a stressed syllable, dun 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 dun. It's kind of pounding or pressing forward. Жил на свете рыцарь бедный, молчаливый и простой, с виду сумрачный и бледный, духом смелый и прямой. Okay, we open up with a 1-syllable verb, жил. Now we would normally expect a verb to get stress, right? Жил. Then a prepositional phrase, на свете, right? Preposition would normally not be stressed. Жил на свете, рыцарь. Okay, there's a noun, syllable in the first, stress on the first syllable. Бедный, adjective, stress on the first syllable. Okay, so I think the scanning that line is pretty straightforward. Жил на свете рыцарь бедный. It's clear we're hearing trochees, right? Now, here in the second line, we have a long adjective, молчаливый, right? Stressed on the молчаливый, third syllable. That means that the first foot here is Pyrrhic, right? No stress. Молчаливый и простой. Okay, in the third line we have молчаливый и простой, right? И про, okay, the conjunction E is not going to be stressed. И простой, but that final syllable is in the adjective. С виду сумрачный, бледный, духом смелый и прямой. Okay, you see we have again two feminine line endings, бедный, бледный. So we don't count that extra syllable in terms of determining the meter. Trochaic tetrameter. Okay, that was also Pushkin, by the way, right? His poem about the poor knight. Okay, what if we have 5 trochees, right? Let's add an extra one, and we would get trochaic pentameter, right? Пятистопный хорей. Okay, here's the super famous poem from Lermontov, right? Выхожу один я на дорогу, сквозь туман кремнистый путь блестит, ночь тиха, пустыня внемлет Богу, и звезда звездою говорит. Okay, this opening salvo here is very famous in terms of poetic meter, and it's kind of off-putting, or it puts us a bit off balance, right? Выхожу. Okay, what meter are we dealing with? Well, it could be actually a ternary meter, as we'll see in a moment, right? We could be dealing with a verse consisting of feet made of 3 syllables, right? So here it takes us a while to fall into the rhythm and actually recognize what meter we're dealing with. Выхожу один я на дорогу, сквозь туман кремнистый путь блестит. Okay, in that second line, we're starting to get a clearer idea. Сквозь туман кремнистый путь блестит. By the way, сквозь is also a preposition. It's kind of a long one, right? So it's kind of debatable. Is that being stressed or not? Is it sort of getting a half stress? Again, it doesn't really matter, and it's in the sense that we're just simply trying to get an idea of what the meter is. And again, the further we go in this poem, the more clear it is that we're dealing with trochaic pentameter. Сквозь туман кремнистый путь блестит, ночь тиха. Okay, look at that. Ночь тиха, right? Noun, that's going to get stress. Тиха, stress on the second syllable. Пустыня, stress on the third syllable. Внемлет, Богу, right? So that third line is perfectly realized trochaic pentameter, right? And at this point, we have no doubt what meter we're dealing with. И звезда звездою говорит. Okay, so again, several nice examples there of Pyrrhic feet, and a really good example, maybe our best yet, of how much the actual rhythm can deviate from the meter, to the extent that we may sometimes be a little bit unsure of what meter we're even hearing, at least initially. Okay, so by the way, is there such thing as trochaic hexameter? I'm sure there is, but I don't really have a famous example, so I'm not going to give one here. Okay, so let's go now to the ternary meters, right? So we've covered now the binary meters, right? Feet consisting of 2 syllables. Now we have meters consisting of feet with 3 syllables, ternary. Трехсложные размеры. The first 3-syllable foot is a dactyl, right? Dactylic verse. And again, we could count the number of feet here, but I'm not going to give a lot of examples here. I'm just going to give you one example each of each kind of ternary foot, right? The first one is dactyl, right? This is a poem from Fiat, right? Буря на небе вечернем, море сердитого шум, буря на море и думы, много мучительных дум. Now, we said earlier that the iamb was the most common foot in traditional Russian poetry. The trochee would, I guess, get second place, right? And these ternary meters would get third place, right? So they're even more unusual, but of course you do see them. And when you do, they're very distinctive, right? You can almost always hear right off the bat that you're dealing with a ternary meter, right? Look at this first line. Буря на небе вечернем, море сердитого шум, right? You can hear those two unstressed syllables. Dun-ta-ta, dun-ta-ta, dun-ta, dun-ta-ta, dun-ta-ta, dun-ta, right? You can start picking up on this regular occurrence of two unstressed syllables in a row. That's kind of your hallmark of a ternary meter. Now, with ternary meters, in any particular poem, it's usually very easy just to, again, hear that you're dealing with ternary meter, but there may be little variations. Look here, for example, each line here has two full dactyls, right? Two dactylic feet. And then the third foot is not a full dactyl, right? We get either just a single stressed syllable, which would be a masculine line ending, and those alternate with stressed syllable, unstressed syllable, which is a feminine line ending. But again, we shouldn't let that really throw us off from saying that we're dealing with dactylic feet, or certainly at the very least we're dealing with a ternary meter, even though that final foot is not really, it's only one or two syllables, so there's certainly nothing ternary about it. Okay, let's go on to the next ternary foot, an anapest, anapest in Russian. So here's a stanza from Lermontov's Rusalka, right, the Rusalka. И шумя и крутясь клебала река, отраженные в ней облака, и пела русалка, и звук ее слов долетал до крутых берегов. Okay, so hopefully you can hear again, da-da-dun, 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 right, the two unstressed syllables right in a row, regularly recurring. It's pretty obvious that we're dealing with a ternary meter. И шумя, и крутясь, колебала река, right? Отраженные в ней облака. Right, so there I'm reading it kind of artificially, right, to the meter. Okay, now look at the third line. We see that the first foot is not an anapest, right? There are only two syllables. So again, Lermontov does that here for whatever reason. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you get this kind of thing quite often with ternary meters. So you shouldn't be too thrown off by little variations here and there with these ternary meters. Now, on that note, if we look at the third type of ternary meter, the amphibrachi, let's look at an example. По небу полуночи ангел летел, и тихую песню он пел. Okay, another line by Lermontov. Okay, so this poem happens to work out pretty easily, right? Pretty nicely, right? We see da-dun-dun, 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 da-dun, right? And then we see this, right, these alternations between these, right, da-dun, basically a final iambic foot and no final iamb. Well, actually, you do have a final iamb, right? The difference is the number of amphibrags in front, right? So first line, 3 amphibrags, then an iamb. Second line, 2 amphibrags, then an iamb, right? So again, you have this variation in line length and even in the type of foot being used. Okay, so this line doesn't really give the best example, but there may be cases where, because of little variations like this, you're not really sure what actual ternary foot you're dealing with, right? It kind of depends on how you count, where you start counting, right? Is this an amphibrach? Is it a dactyl? Is it an anapest, right? But again, for our purposes now, it isn't really that important, but just it's something to look out for, right? But no matter how we count this here, it's still pretty obvious we're dealing with ternary meter. And again, let's read once more. По небу полуночь ангел летел, и тихую песню он пел, и месяц, и звезды, и тучи толпой внимали той песне святой. Okay, in any poetic tradition, over time you're going to get new poets coming along, and they're going to try to push the envelope. They're going to try to be original in one way or another, either in terms of their content or their form. And so a lot of traditional rules, right, of versification, of meter, that someone like Pushkin or Lermontov may have normally adhered to, later poets are going to start experimenting with looser structuring principles, right? So let's mention a couple of these. These are called in Russian tonicheskое стихосложение, right? Tonic versification, I guess, as opposed to syllabatonic. or as we normally call it, accentual versification, right? So the governing principle here, we're getting away from a strict syllable count, and we're focused only on the number of accents, right, of accented syllables, that is, of stressed syllables in a given line of poetry. So there are two major kinds of accentual verse in Russian, dolnik and taktavik. Both of these are fairly unusual, right? So they're kind of special. They would be later, right, after the Golden Age. So we're talking here like Silver Age and futurist poetry, right? So basically turn of the century, 20th century stuff. So dolnik basically means that every line of poetry for the meter dolnik, right, this accentual system of versification, would have a certain number of stressed syllables, with one or two unstressed syllables coming in between the stressed ones. Okay, so again, the only governing principle here really is the number of stressed syllables, right, say 4 per line. And in between them, we could have one or two unstressed syllables. Now, as you might imagine, the way this works out is that often dolnik can seem like you're dealing with a syllabatonic verse, right? Like you may be looking at iambic poetry, but then you'll start seeing a number of deviations, and you realize that, okay, I'm dealing with a somewhat looser system of versification, namely dolnik. This is something to watch out for in Silver Age poetry. That's where you'll see this most often, right? And again, it can often trick you at first. You can think you're hearing iambs or troches or whatever, and then after several lines, you realize that there are too many deviations here. This is indeed dolnik. Taktavik is even looser, right? Again, the governing principle is the number of stressed syllables per line. So let's say maybe 3 or 4 stressed syllables per line, right? Now, in between any two stressed syllables, we can have 2, 3, or even 4 unstressed syllables, right? So that's a very loose type of accentual verse, right? And that's pretty recognizable as clearly not having anything to do with syllabatonic verse, right? So when you hear taktavik, it's usually perfectly clear that you're not dealing with da dun da dun da dun da dun, right? Or dun da dun da dun da dun, right? It's much looser. And the poet who's most associated with taktavik, without question, is Mayakovsky, right? You may think, if you've heard any Mayakovsky, right? It may almost have struck you as basically just free verse, meaning having really no, governing, metrical principle whatsoever, just kind of basically prose that's being, broken down in the page line by line, but with no further principle. But again, even Mayakovsky, is usually, it does have a metrical structure. It's called taktavik. And if we scan the first stanza of his poem, Avsyotiki, we see what's actually going on here. We have 4 stressed syllables in each verse, right? And in between, we have 1, 2, 3, or even 4 unstressed syllables. And we actually see that right off the bat here. Улица провалилась, right? Улица prava, right? 4 unstressed syllables right in a row. So that's kind of the most extreme case, and he throws it at us right at the very beginning. Улица провалилась, как нос сифилитика. Right? So let's say if we wandered into one of his readings and we were expecting to hear Pushkin-like verse, then right off the bat here, it's pretty clear we're dealing with something much more radical, at least in terms of both form and content. And now, of course, we read this rather scandalous poem, and it's kind of, borderline vulgar in terms of the content, right? So again, there's this sense that the form is rather revolutionary. The content is anything but bourgeois, right? It's sort of just, as he would say, a slap in the face of public taste, both in terms of form and content. Okay, so that's enough for today. I wanted today just to look at the different types of meter, right? Syllabatonic verse, accentual verse, and in coming lessons, we'll look at some other details of that we see in poetry, namely variations in certain words that may be chosen depending on the number of syllables a poet is looking for, right? And then we'll look later at scanning a poem more carefully and analyzing it formally and seeing the ways in which the form, right, the meter, the rhythm fits in with the content of the poem. Okay, so until next time, до свидания, товарищи.